talk about Hatred, one of the most controversial games ever created. Not because it failed as a game mechanically, but because of what the player is actually doing inside the game. The player controls the unnamed protagonist, often just called the Antagonist. A man filled with pure hatred for humanity, who decides to go on a massive killing spree. That concept alone is what made the game explode into controversy long before players even were allowed to play it. The game was developed by Destructive Creations and released in 2015. The developers described it as a reaction to what they felt was an industry full of safe, political correct games. Their goal was basically to make something that intentionally pushed the boundaries. Not a horror game about monsters or war game with soldiers, but a game where the horror comes from the player controlling someone committing atrocities against civilians. And of course, right from the start, the tone is extremely dark. The game opens with a monologue from the main character standing in his house. The speech sets the tone for everything that follows. He talks about how much he despises humanity, calling people parasites, and expressing complete disgust with the world. It's not presented as heroic or comedic. It's cold, nihilistic, and very uncomfortable by design. The character then grabs his weapons, walks outside, and begins the rampage. When people talk about Hatred, most of the discussion ends up focusing on the controversy and the violence, but the gameplay itself is actually pretty straightforward. It's not particularly innovative, and honestly, it never really tries to be that. The mechanics are simple and familiar, but they work well enough to support the kind of chaotic experience the developers were aiming for. The game relies less on complicated systems and more on intensity, destruction, and constant combat pressure. Movement itself is pretty simple, but responsive. The character runs through streets, buildings, train stations, military bases, and other locations, while constantly encountering enemies or civilians. There are also basic interactions with the environment, like kicking doors, climbing through windows, or entering vehicles. Vehicles play a small role in certain sections, where you can drive through areas or use a mounted weapon. Combat is where most of the gameplay time is spent. The character starts with basic firearms, like a pistol or rifle, but weapons are constantly being picked up from defeated enemies or found in the environment. Over the course of a level, you can accumulate an entire arsenal: shotguns, assault rifles, machine guns, rocket launchers, grenade launchers, even flamethrowers, and heavy military equipment, but that of course comes later in the game. Each of the weapons fill a slightly different role. Pistols are weak but precise. Rifles offer balanced damage and range. Shotguns are devastating up close. And explosives are, well, useful for destroying groups of enemies or vehicles. Switching weapons quickly becomes important because the situation can change rapidly when multiple enemy types appear at once. The game also includes a system that encourages aggressive play. The main character heals by performing executions on downed enemies or civilians. When someone is injured but not dead, the player can walk up and trigger a brutal finishing move. These executions restore health, which means staying in the middle of the chaos is often safer than trying to run away from it. Enemy types are fairly simple individually, but they escalate as the game progresses. Early in the game you mostly encounter panicked civilians and lightly armed individuals trying to defend themselves. They might carry pistols or improvised weapons, but they are not particularly organized. Very quickly the police begin to arrive. Standard police officers carry handguns and sometimes shotguns. They tend to move in small groups and are more aggressive than civilians. They will actively chase the player across the map. After that, the response becomes even heavier, with SWAT teams begin to appearing with stronger weapons, better armor, and coordinated attacks. These enemies are harder to kill and tend to push the player into a more intense firefight. Later levels also introduce military force, which represents the most dangerous enemy in the game. Soldiers may carry automatic rifles, explosives, and sometimes arrive at armored vehicles or helicopters. Their attacks are more relentless, and surviving these encounters requires heavier weapons and careful positioning. While the enemy variety is not extremely large, the escalation creates a sense of growing resistance. The more chaos the player causes, the more powerful the force that arrives to stop him. And despite all these elements, it's fair to say the gameplay itself is not revolutionary. It borrows ideas that already existed in many other twin-stick shooters and action games. There are no complex skill trees, no deep character progression, and no complicated mechanics. But that simplicity is also part of why the game works for what it's trying to do. The focus is on fast, chaotic action, where the player is constantly under pressure from enemies while moving through destructible environments. Instead of innovation, the game relies on intensity and atmosphere. The simple mechanics allow players to immediately understand how everything works here, leaving them free to focus on surviving increasingly dangerous situations. In the end, the gameplay of Hatred can be described as brutally straightforward. Move through a level, fight waves of enemies, gather weapons, complete destructive objectives, and escape before the overwhelming forces take you down. Now we get to the actual thing that made Hatred known. The thing that made Hatred infamous was how it was marketed. The reveal trailer immediately sparked outrage online. It showed the main character executing civilians and delivering a monologue about his hatred for humanity. The tone was extremely aggressive and bleak, not seen in other games before at that time. At one point, the game was actually temporarily removed from Steam's Greenlight system, which was the platform where indie developers tried to get their games approved for sale on Steam. This removal caused huge debate across the gaming community about censorship and artistic freedom. Interestingly, Gabe Newell personally stepped in and allowed the game back into the platform, saying that removing it had been a mistake. That decision itself created even more discussion, because it raised questions about where the limits of game content should be. When the game finally released, critics had very mixed reactions. Some people criticized it heavily, saying the game was shallow and existed mostly for shock value. Others defended it as a form of artistic expression, or maybe even satire, even if it was extremely uncomfortable for them. And from a gameplay perspective, many reviewers said the game mechanics themselves were fairly basic. The shooting works fine, but doesn't introduce a lot of new ideas compared to other twin-stick shooters. The controversy around the subject matter overshadowed almost everything else about the game. Another interesting aspect is how the protagonist is written. Unlike many violent games, where the player character has motivation like revenge, survival or justice, the main character in Hatred is deliberately written as someone with no redeeming qualities at all. He isn't meant to be sympathetic. He openly despises everyone and everything. The developers actually described him more as a force of destruction than a traditional character. The game never tries to justify his actions or explain a tragic backstory that will make players feel sorry for him. Because of that, many players interpreted the game differently. Some see it as pure exploitative design, only to shock. Others see it as a kind of commentary about nihilism or about the darker impulses that exist in media and society. The controversy also connects to a broader history of violent games sparking debate. Games like GTA and Postal previously faced criticism for allowing players to harm civilians, but Hatred pushed the concept even further, because violence against civilians isn't optional background chaos, it's literally the entire focus of the game. And that is also why the game became a huge talking point when it was announced. Many news outlets discussed whether a game like this should even exist, while others argued that banning or censoring it would set a dangerous precedent for creative freedom. Today, Hatred remains a kind of strange piece of gaming history. It's not remembered as a technical masterpiece or a revolutionary gameplay experience. Instead, it's remembered as a moment when the gaming industry had a massive conversation about violence, artistic expression, censorship, and shock value. And my friends, that is the end of my little Hatred ramble. I hope you enjoyed this video. Did you play this game? And most importantly, what did you enjoy about this game? Let me know in the comments, of course, if I can change anything about my video, my editing type thing. Even though I'm doing little editing here and there. But yeah, still, I hope you enjoyed my video, my ranting. and I hope I see you in the next video. Bye!